Okay.
Yeah.
Let me do this. I want to record. Okay. So anyway, again, my name's Marion Wingfield. I work at the Ames Free Library. Welcome to all of you who are joining us tonight for a talk about something we're really interested in right now, the pandemic, the invisible enemy of 1918. And Ed and I, this is Ed Hands, who is a historian, a well-known and well-loved person in town who was a history teacher at Oliver Ames, and he has been involved with the Historical Society and the Lions Club in the Easton Grange. He's second vice president for the Easton Historical Society, actually. And he is really a man about town, and he does amazing research. And we all fall back on Ed when we want to know anything, especially about Easton. So welcome, Ed. Thank you so much for doing this for us. We are eager to hear what we're going to talk about. And hopefully, we were talking about redemption. Hopefully, we'll feel a little redemption at the end of this, given what's going on in our country right now. So take it away.
All right. Hi, folks. The pandemic of 1918 has been called the greatest pandemic in the history of humanity that no one remembers. Uh, uh, I remember it because I'm very lucky to be here. My parents were born in the midst of the epidemic. My mother was born in December of 1918 and my dad in January of 1919. Uh, Two of my great uncles, actually the only two of my great uncles, both came down with the flu. One right here in Massachusetts at Commonwealth Pier, which some people say is the epicenter of the second wave, the bad wave of the epidemic, and one overseas. Um, and the one who came down with the flu overseas managed to survive. However, his grandson, my cousin, uh, didn't manage to survive COVID. He passed away just 2 weeks ago. So there's a lot of connections between what's going on now and what's going on over 100 years ago. Um, we we celebrated at the Historical Society the 100th anniversary of the epidemic with a little article that I wrote for Reminiscences, which is our annual magazine. And it's been fun to update um, and compare to what's going on today. So rather than look at me for an extended period of time, let me start a screen share here. And if I do that, there we go. So this is a picture of an emergency hospital that was set up in Brookline, and just as we're concerned about today, the epidemic hit so hard and so fast, medical facilities were swamped. Um, some of the reasons were different from what we have going for us now. Remember, there was a war on at this time, and a lot of the doctors and nurses were overseas. So there was a shortage of medical personnel, and these hospitals were often run by the State Guard, which was a group of older people who took over when the National Guard was called up to go fight the war. So there are enduring questions about the pandemic because it took place 100 years ago. No one knew what was really going on at the time. So we don't know exactly where the Spanish flu originated, other than the fact that it didn't originate in Spain. There was a war going on, as I've mentioned, and there was censorship in the United States, England, and France um, to prevent people's morale from going down. So when flu broke out overseas, the only press that was free to report it was the Spanish newspapers. So it got the name of the Spanish flu. People in Spain called it the French flu. So uh, it the name didn't catch on, sadly. Um, the big question, and the one that remains unanswered to this day, despite the fact that there was this guy named Tony Fauci who spent about 20 years actually researching this pandemic to get ready for the one he's helping us through today. We don't know why so many people in the prime of life died, beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm going to be actually presenting some new research that indicate that there may be some stuff that folks haven't looked at quite as much as they should have. The other question is, why did the public health officials or how did the public health officials in Massachusetts fight the disease? Not very hard. That's the problem. And then finally, did the pandemic have a lasting effect? And I think you'll be surprised that it did have a lasting effect in many ways. So we all probably know that the Spanish flu was influenza A, H1N1, and then after that, if you're a virologist, there would be some additional letters and a name of a place after that. H1N1. These are the H and the N are the places where the flu attaches to a human cell, and they can all be identified this way. There are now 18 H's and 11 N's, so there's over 200 combinations of flu. There's dog flu, and there's horse flu. We can't get those, at least yet, but flu from birds and flu from pigs, very, very transmissible to humans. I used to work with the ducks down at sheep pasture, and the state poultry inspector would come in and vaccinate all the chickens and would refuse to have anything to do with ducks. And the reason was ducks are a incredibly healthy species of birds, but they carry the flu virus. It doesn't affect them, but it can affect other birds. There's H1N1 is the name of that flu. So where did it come from? Well, this is sort of in the range of myth and legend as well. No one is really sure where it began because it came in 3 stages. The first stage was just a really bad seasonal flu, like, we're having somewhere out there, we're having a flu epidemic right now. We're just not paying any attention to it. Hopefully you've all been vaccinated for the flu this year. But there was a particularly bad one. It emerged, some people argue, in a large camp in Étampes, France, where there were troops and workers that had been brought in from China to dig trenches. So this bad seasonal flu started over there in 1917. Early in 1918, it ended up at Fort Riley, Kansas, which was a troop training and transfer station and a major supply center where there were live animals. Does that sound familiar? Live animal market? The first, I just put this one in 10 minutes ago. The first patient is Albert Gatchell. And the reason I put that in is that a prominent member of the Lions Club, Scott Cudsey, this is his great uncle, and he legitimately is the first person in the United States to come down with H1N1 pandemic flu in early 1918. This first wave in the first part of 1918 wasn't that bad. He managed to survive. The first soldiers did die, however, beginning around March. And then, just like the
Ed,
flu does, just like the
Ed, it's Scott Cudsey here. Albert Gitchell, like you mentioned, was my great uncle. Actually, it's Gitchell with GIT. But if, in case you're interested, if you can see him,
oh, there he
that's
is.
Albert Gitchell, patient number 1 at Fort Riley.
Yep. Patient number 1 is what every epidemiologist looks for, because that's how you start tracing what's going on. And the interesting thing here is that he was a cook, which meant that not only was he exposed to the soldiers, but he was exposed to whatever animals were on the post as well. The belief now is that this flu that was there at Fort Riley mutated in the chickens and the pigs over the course of the summer. And then that's what broke out as what we really know as the Spanish flu epidemic. So it disappeared in the spring, but it reappeared in Boston on August 27th. And you'll hear in some places that Boston was the epicenter and beginning point of this global pandemic. Luckily for us, if you really look at the record, it happened almost simultaneously in several places on the East Coast and in Sierra Leone in Africa for whatever reason. And the reason really was the transfer of troops back and forth due to the war. So the September and October peak, which was the most deadly part of the flu, there was a tail end to that wave into December, and then a third wave starts in December and goes through the end of the year. But this September, October peak, about half the people that were exposed to it came down with it, and mortality rates ranged from 1% to 3%, which doesn't sound like much when you consider a disease like Ebola kills 90% of the people that come down with it. The problem that made the flu so bad was that if 1% of, it's like that story you used to hear about, if every person in China just buys one Coke, Coke will become an incredibly wealthy country. Well, everybody came down with the flu, and if 1% of the people died, that's a lot of people, okay? And they died really fast sometimes. So just like with COVID, you can make the argument that no one ever died of the flu because 80% of the fatalities, it's estimated, took place when the flu weakened the lungs of a person, and then bacterial pneumonia came in and killed them off. The first boy to die in Easton was Chester Rice Smith. And this is exactly what happened to him. He was one of the Navy boys who got infected in Boston early in the epidemic and recovered, came home to recuperate, and that's when the pneumonia infection came along and killed him off. What made the flu particularly scary for doctors was about 20% of the deaths occurred from what we now call a cytokine storm, where the immune system overreacts. We've heard about this with COVID. And what would happen is within an hour or two, the lungs would fill up, the face would get a brown spot on the cheek, and then the lips would turn blue, and then the person would die within a few hours. He would essentially drown in the fluid in his own lungs. Legend has it, although I've never been able to prove it, that a worker left the shovel shop because he wasn't feeling well, walked to the top of Sullivan Ave, and died at the top of Sullivan Ave of this cytokine storm. The argument has always been, or has recently been, that the cytokine storm is much more likely to happen with people with strong immune systems, in other words, healthy adults, and that kids haven't got an immune system that's fully formed, and old people like me have an immune system that's way past its prime. So we're lucky enough to avoid these storms. But I'm not sure that that's actually true 100%. And we're going to look at that a little bit later. So the largest number of people were in the who died were in the category 25 to 40. And the question is, was there some other underlying causes or really stupid doctors? And we can make a case for both of those. So let's take a look at the Boston timeline, which is very disappointing, and then look at Easton, and then take a look at some pictures. So I want to emphasize that way back in 1904, what became the American Lung Association was founded, and it promoted anti-spitting campaigns, mask wearing, social distancing, and quarantine to try to stop the spread of tuberculosis. So this prepared people for what we call today NPIs, which are non-pharmaceutical interventions. And the Lung Association was pretty important in reducing the rate of tuberculosis. In the 1890s, as many as 1 in 6 people in the United States came down with tuberculosis. It was the leading cause of death ahead of heart disease and cancer and all of those things. All right. And the idea was if you had TB, you should be wearing a mask. Social distancing, if you had TB, you should stay away from people. And quarantine was a way to make sure that contact didn't occur. The Lung Association also promoted open air therapy, which was also tried when we came along with the flu. So the flu started in Boston, August 27th, 1918. 2 sailors got sick. 2 days later, there were 58 sailors with the flu. And by September 3rd, the first civilian cases happened. Okay. Boston was surrounded by Army and Navy activity. Newport, Rhode Island was a huge naval base. Boston was a gigantic naval base. And Fort Devens in Air, 45 miles west of Boston, had over 50,000 soldiers at the time. Devens had as many as 10,000 people at a time down with the flu and had a very, very high mortality rate. We need to remember that back in those days, there were first responders as well. And the doctors and the nurses were very, very quickly overwhelmed. And they sought out volunteers, no experience necessary. And one of those people that volunteered was Olivia Ames from Sheep Pasture, and the family butler's daughter, Marie Parks. Both went out there. Olivia Ames caught the flu, almost died, and was months and months recuperating. Miss Parks apparently had no ill effects. The State Guard builds its first tent hospital on September 9th, and a day later it was filled with 200 patients. So you can see that by September 9th, which is just less than 2 weeks after the epidemic broke out, it was already completely out of control. People have criticized Boston for not taking quick action, but you have to cut them some slack because everybody thought it was just a little flu that would miraculously disappear. That's the way it always happened. So we talk about super spreader events, and right in the middle of the epidemic was the Red Sox winning their last World Series for 86 years. September 11th was the day that they won that World Series. So there was a huge crowd in Boston, which definitely was going to cause problems. Okay. September 11th was also the day that Boston took its first action, and basically they authorized the police to arrest people who were spitting in public. Now, if you're of my age, you'll remember that when you were riding on the subway, there was always painted someplace, no spitting. You don't see those signs at the T anymore today because I don't think that's a habit that people have anymore. But it was a big deal back then because it was considered to be the #1 way to spread an infectious disease like tuberculosis or the flu. Boston recommended against using whiskey, which is, I think, an ideal cure for the flu, and quinine. Quinine. Keep that one in mind. It had a revival in our current epidemic. And 2 days later, just to show that nobody knew what was going on, the U.S. Surgeon General recommended using quinine and aspirin to treat the flu. So nobody knew what was going on. The bad news here is quinine was essentially harmless here. It just didn't do any good. And it does have some side effects, but not much. I've never been poisoned by a gin and tonic, so that's what gives the tonic its flavor. But the aspirin was really bad. Aspirin has a really interesting history. We were fighting the Germans, and the #1 producer of aspirin in the world was Bayer Aspirin of Germany. But just before we entered into the war, their patent ran out in the United States. So a whole bunch of people were producing aspirin and promoting it very vigorously as a cure-all. The problem is we know now that if you take the dosage that was recommended by the Surgeon General and other members of the naval medical staff, you get exactly the same symptoms as this cytokine storm. Your lungs fill up with fluid and you die. And we now believe that it wasn't only the flu that was killing the soldiers and sailors and some of the civilians. It was aspirin as well. Doctors finally on the 17th, 20 days after the outbreak, began wearing masks. 41 people died in Boston on the 17th. 10 days later, exactly a month after the flu epidemic started, theaters, schools, dance halls were ordered closed until October 7th. They weren't going to keep them closed for very long. Public funerals were banned, and unnecessary gatherings, whatever those are, were also banned. They tried to get the trolley company to put on more trolley cars, but they didn't have more trolley cars. The idea was more cars, you could spread the people out. So what they did is they agreed to disinfect the cars every day. And again, more people died. October 4th, flu becomes a reportable disease here in Massachusetts. 183 people died in Boston. What are you going to do with all those people? That's a big question. Finally, on October 5th, Boston saloons, bowling alleys, soda fountains, pool rooms, and other public recreations were banned. The mayor asked for a temporary suspension of religious services, feeling apparently that he didn't have the constitutional right to ban them outright. And police officers were finally issued masks. Boston never shut down retail stores, offices, or restaurants. And because they didn't shut down restaurants, saloons started to serve food so that they could be exempt from the ban. So this is what we call locking the door after the horse escapes, because 150 people died in Boston that day. Now, here's something. Beginning on October 6th, Boston police were to be inoculated with convalescent serum. Another 190 people died. What's convalescent serum? Well, it's something that our medical people in our age forgot about until somebody brought it up in the midst of the COVID. And basically what you do is you take plasma from a person who's recuperated from the from the flu and inject it into a person that is either sick or needs to be protected. And the idea is, well, back then, it just seemed to work. Nowadays, we know that there's antibodies in the plasma that can have some effect some of the time on whether a person comes down with something like COVID. We have to remember that in 1918, no one had ever seen a virus before because it was too small, too tiny, and bacteria had only been seen under a microscope and attached to a disease in the 1880s. So what's going on in Easton? Well, from the middle of, well, from when influenza becomes a reportable disease on October 4th to the end of the year, there are 589 reported cases of flu in Easton, which is 10% of the population. But Dr. Frank Tilden, who was head of the Board of Health, noted that in the 2 weeks before the reportability requirement, lots and lots of people got sick, okay? The first cases appeared in Easton around September 15th, which is 2 weeks after Boston began to be hit. By the 19th of September, 11 people had died in Brockton, and 1,000 kids from the Brockton school systems were sent home. Easton closed its schools for 3 weeks in September 23rd and 24th. Bridgewater closed on the 23rd, and our schools closed on the 24th. And the schools would be closed for a second period of multiple weeks when the flu came back. Thanks to Bill Hanna, the president of the Old Colony Historical Society, we know a little bit more about what was happening in Bridgewater than what we know was happening with the businesses in Easton. And the Stanley Iron Works in Bridgewater, which was a big ironworks, was running 2 shifts a day. And the people there were so sick that they couldn't run the second shift, and only half the people showed up for the first shift. So Stanley was so appalled by this that the company put a hospital in one of their tenements, and it was an 11-bed hospital. You have to realize that hospitals outside of big cities were a new idea, and Brockton Hospital had only been started around 1902, and many doctors had private hospitals, which were sort of like a motel, I guess, attached to their homes. So having a hospital with 11 beds in it wasn't all that unusual in those days. There was definitely a shortage of nurses and doctors, and you read in the newspapers about a lot of shuffling of nurses from one place to another. So if a town got hard hit, they'd get nurses from someplace else and then give them up after the peak flu went by. Beginning of October, the Northeastern District nurse needed an auto to visit all her patients. Those were just patients in Northeastern, which was the hardest hit part of town. Keep that in mind. Hardest hit part of town. So what was happening was the nurse and the doctors were visiting people in Northeastern all the time to see how they were doing. The other parts of town basically had one visit from a doctor or a nurse, and they slapped on the quarantine sign on the outside, and that was it. I remember talking to a person who lived through the flu epidemic. His house was quarantined, and just like we went through with the lockdown, they had a hard time getting food and all of this sort of stuff into the house to keep going. Luckily, no one died in that family, okay? By October 4th, the town sprang for 2 nurses to work in Southeastern. Dr. Tilden on that day saw 210 people, and Brockton is suffering about 25 deaths a day. Soda fountains in Brockton were closed on the 4th, and the soda fountain issue has one of the biggest long-term impacts of the flu epidemic. because just like the saloon owners who tried to serve food in order to become restaurants rather than saloons, soda fountains thought that they could get away with everybody's fear of using glasses by serving for the first time a new technological development, which was disposable paper cups. And obviously that's something that caught on for sanitary reasons. Now we just use it for, savings and convenience, okay? By October 6th here in Easton, it was thought that the crisis had passed and things were going to get better. In reality, about half the deaths of the town had passed by. We don't really know how many deaths occurred in Easton. The official town report says that there were 32 Easterners who died, 3 who died outside of town, 2 of which were first responders. Lawrence Swift was an orderly at a medical hospital, an Army hospital in El Paso, and a Nystrom girl had just graduated from nursing school in Providence, and she died in a hospital in Providence trying to help people. But so there's 29 in the official report. If you look at something called excess deaths, you take an average of all the people who died for 5 years before, and then look at the number of people who died in the flu year, there were a lot more. 43 people instead of 29 people in town died. So we don't really know, but everybody was hoping by the 6th things were going okay. Some towns had put up their own hospitals, and our town was considering taking the Unionville School, which is now the dentist's office up on Washington Street, and turning that into a hospital. But the State Guard built a tent hospital next to Brockton Hospital, and we were allowed to use that. And we only had to send 4 patients over there. October 7th, public meetings were officially banned. Schools remained closed. Churches remained closed voluntarily here in Easton, except for Immaculate Conception. They decided to have a mass without their priest because he was in the process of dying from already contracting the flu. There were 2 priests from Immaculate Conception that died. One had moved on and had become a chaplain in the Navy at the Boston Navy Yard, and he came down with the flu and died. On October 7th, Mrs. John Ames opened a milk station on Main Street so that people who were in quarantine or in desperate need of food could at least come and get milk from the Langwater Guernsey herd. Dr. Tilden, in his report at the end of the year, said that the flu hit the Portuguese people in town very, very hard, and that many of them were so poor and so stricken that they died of malnutrition rather than the flu. All right, let's take a look at some pictures. Everything old is new again, and you can see right from the start, you still have to get to the hospital. We were lucky in 1918. At the front, there was more horses used in World War I than in any other war in human history, which actually lasted into World War II. But here in Boston, there were mechanical or automotive ambulances. And you can see not everybody here is masked up. One of the officers that's at the back of the ambulance is not wearing a mask, although he has one on his chest. And then down below here, you can see the current situation. You don't need 4 nurses to carry the stretcher anymore because you pull it out and the legs drop down and only a couple of guys are needed to pull it. The idea of emergency spaces is also a little bit different. You have two pictures here of emergency hospitals on the left, and here are a bunch of people that we know now are contagious, crowded in together. And if you look at the soldier in the middle of the floor, he's not wearing a mask. Today, if you look at the picture on the upper right, those beds were the ones that were put into the DCI Center in Worcester, which ironically enough is the place where Olive Ames won its first, it's not our first, and it's not our most recent, won the girls' state basketball championship in 2006. Of course, no championships right now either. I like this picture the best of all because this really shows you how things have changed from 1918 till today. The one on the left is clearly a hospital in 1918. It's either an army hospital or one where the state guard is in charge. The sanitary conditions are fantastic. The people are wearing masks. They don't seem to be wearing gloves. And there's no respirator. There's no air tent. There's nothing. This poor guy is dying of the flu, and he is not getting any help other than the people that are standing there watching him go. And now you take a look on the other side, you see all the people, all the machinery, the respirators, and innovative treatment. If you take a close look at the person, she's flipped over on her tummy, which is supposedly the best new way to treat people that are in respiratory distress with COVID. It makes it easier for them to breathe. Doesn't work for me. I can't sleep on my stomach, but they tell me it works. Okay. You can hear my dog hacking away in the back, perhaps. She has to sleep on her back because that's how she sleeps the best. What do you do with the bodies? Well, in Philadelphia, they just dug huge trenches and threw the bodies in. And before they were thrown in, they were simply piled up in the basement of the hospital. On the right, you have the pictures of the morgue freezer trucks that were brought in at the height of the pandemic in New York City. And virtual learning took place. This is the University of Montana, and these poor guys dressed in winter coats who look like they're freezing are taking part in a physics class. It's out in the open air, so it was supposed to be okay, but everybody was crowded together and not wearing masks. Not wearing masks is typically American. So we don't need to beat up Donald Trump so much for that, because we all know that we don't like wearing masks either. So it's not necessarily his fault. On the right-hand side, you see a virtual classroom today. This is the way it works at Olive Ames, although the kids aren't sitting that close together. So you have some in a class and some appearing on screen. And you really should thank your teachers here in town, because one of my jobs is working with student teachers. I had 2 student teachers at Olive Ames, and this is the way that their classes went. I sat in and was surprised to bump into a high school student one day who said, "Oh, you were in my class the other day." And I was there virtually rather than sitting in the back. Okay. So non-pharmaceutical interventions. One of the biggest things that's happened in the last 20 years is that modern day epidemiologists have tried to study the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions. Why? Well, if a novel coronavirus comes along that there's no medicines or no vaccines for, the only way you can fight it is non-pharmaceutically. And that's what happened in the United States back in the day, in 1918. No one's been able to study mask wearing because mostly it was voluntary or only for specific groups. So the ones that have been studied are school closings, business closings, social distancing. Also, public information campaigns. One, the colorful poster that's telling you that influenza is frequently complicated with pneumonia comes from Chicago. Go home and go to bed until you're well or dead. And then the one on the right comes from Quincy. And it tells people to boil sheets, boil the dishes if anybody has flu in your house. People were worried about what we call fomites, which is picking up a disease off of something rather than from somebody. And so in Boston, the streets were washed every night because they were afraid that the very street would carry the influenza virus. No mask, no service. This is a streetcar on the left. And the guy is saying, "You're not coming on, sir. You're not wearing a mask." It turns out that the cities on in the center and the west coast of the United States did much better with this than we did, primarily because they knew what was coming. It spread, the second wave that we're talking about spread from east to west. And theater closings, any large gathering was stopped as quickly as possible. And businesses complain, obviously, just as they do today. And then finally, the question is, when do you pull back from your interventions? We have a picture over here on the left-hand side of churches being reopened in a town in the Midwest, and everybody flocked to mass. So the church was filled up inside, and this was the overflow on the outside. That obviously contributed to the third wave of influenza. And then down below, you have a certain person who insisted upon having rallies. The initial statistics are in from that, and it's suggested that tens of thousands of COVID infections took place from these rallies and several hundred deaths. So were there any cures? Well, here we have soldiers gargling with water, salt water. And the idea was you'd gargle with water and then you'd squirt the salt water up your nose, a saline solution. And the idea was, oh, maybe it'll kill the virus. It might have actually been fairly effective at killing the bacteria that was in your nose. Aspirin and quinine were both recommended, as I've mentioned before. Aspirin was not a good choice because the dosage was way too high. And the one thing that actually worked and was in high demand was this convalescent serum. Here with us, we've heard bleach recommended, not a good choice, and hydrochloroquine, which is actually a modern version of quinine. Didn't work with the flu, didn't work with COVID. And convalescent serum is something that people are trying these days. And the sophisticated version of convalescent serum is this antibody therapy that President Trump got to use because the owner of the company offered this experimental treatment. So convalescent serum may be one of the big things that came out of the flu epidemic. So you can see The bigger the dot was, the more intense um, public health response. We don't have a lot of dots in Massachusetts. We just have a lot of cities that have small dots that merge together. But the East Coast did very, very poorly with this. And then, my God, there were so many people dying that the rest of the country began to pay attention. And this shows you just exactly what could happen. Philadelphia, like Boston, did not really jump on the bandwagon to do anything to stop the flu. They thought it was just regular flu. So their first case occurred in September 17th. And the first thing that they did to try to stop it was on October 3rd. And you can see the huge spike in deaths in Philadelphia. St. Louis enacted their first non-pharmaceutical interventions 2 days after the first case of flu showed up. And basically what they did is they flattened the curve. Curve flattening works to initially slow things down, but it also has a long-term effect of not having high totals at the end. One of the things that everybody worried about, President Trump in particular, was the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions on the economy. And studies have been done from 1914 to 1919 on the impact of the flu epidemic on the economy. The short-term effects are always bad. If you shut businesses down, they're not making money. So what you're really trying to do is get the thing over with quickly enough so that you can back off and keep the medium-term effects better. If you take a look at the red dots, these are cities in the United States that were slow to start non-pharmaceutical interventions or just didn't do very many of them. And if you look, it has across the bottom deaths per 100,000, and the line going up is change in manufacturing employment. And basically what it shows you is that in the cities that did not react quickly, they bounced back much more slowly than the cities on the West Coast that did react quickly and had very strict social distancing requirements for the shortest period of time. While it needs to be studied more, many people believe that this was a contributing factor to the migration of manufacturing out of the New England area. We just never really did bounce back from this. Many of our businesses, including our own shovel works, were not doing that fantastic prior to the war. And after the war was over, with a number of people dead and the economy coming back slowly, they couldn't keep up with competitors in other parts of the country. So this is a real picture. It's hard to find a real picture of somebody suffering from the flu in their own home. But what happened here was this is here in Massachusetts. This little girl got so worried about her mommy in this ramshackle house that she actually went and called the Red Cross, and the Red Cross arrived, took a picture, and then tried to treat the mother. So you can get a look at the conditions in the home. The paint's coming off the wall, that's lead paint. The bed's not quite long enough for her to sit on, or is that a couch? Maybe that's not even a bed. And the house just doesn't look all that wonderful and sanitary. Was there an underlying cause to the flu? Well, let's take a look. Here are some of the underlying, here are some of the victims from Easton. as I mentioned, it's hard to tote them up, but all of these folks died of either influenza or pneumonia. Uh, One of the youngest persons to die was John Ruggiero. He lived at 11 Picker Lane with his dad, Vincenzo. And Vincenzo had worked at the Shovel Works, but, and this was a Shovel Works tenement. Uh, they'd worked at the Shovel Works, but he had gotten a job at the Four River Shipyard and was about to move out of Easton. His son died um, on September 29th, and they moved out on November 2nd. It's interesting. I was reading some Quincy papers, and the the person who was in charge of the Quincy shipyards, the Four River Shipyard, at this time, also had a son who was only a year old, born in 1917. Little Johnny Ruggiero died at age 6, and no one ever heard of him. The boy that was the son of the manager, Jack, went on to become president of the United States. Clara Johnson was the wife of a shovel worker, and she lived at 25 William Street. This is the only house that we know of where more than one death occurred. She was the owner of the house. Many of the Swedes by this time had been in town for long enough to save up and build this beautiful house that's still there today. All of these houses are still there today. And she passed away very, very early in the epidemic. And then later on, in the 4th of December, Mary Todd, who was the wife of the boarder who was living there, also a shovel worker, died as well. Okay. Marjorie Burt's probably the saddest story of all. She had married a guy who worked at the machine shop in Stoughton, and they had recently married, and she was about to have a baby. So they decided that rather than live in a crowded tenement, she'd come home to Furnace Village and live in beautiful Furnace Village with her parents till the baby was delivered. The baby was delivered on October 6th. She died of the flu on October 7th. Okay. The oldest person to die of the flu epidemic was Minetta Osman, another unlucky person. Her daughter had married here in Easton, and they were living in a duplex on Center Street when they invited Minetta to come down from Canada so she could live with her daughter and her 2 grandchildren. Well, she was here for 2 years, came down with the flu, and died. Today, December 17th, Andrew Mason, a Scottish gardener, died. He was the gardener for Mary Frothingham, and this is 1918. Mary Frothingham's estate, which is now our town hall, was only 5 years old. So he was one of the people that was in charge of actually setting up the original garden. And he lived in one of the 7 houses on what we call Battle Row, or the 7 Sisters on Elm Street. The numbers aren't consistent with what they were in 1918, but one of those houses was where he lived. So you can see the houses. None of them are McMansions by any means, and most of them are fairly small. The youngest fatality was a year old. The oldest was Minetta. She was 69. The average age was 32, which means that, just like everybody says, this hit the young adult population much harder than any other group. The town was almost 50-50 male and female, but there was an excess of fatalities among the males. Which indicates that since most women didn't work at this time, outside the house. Please let me get back to that one. Yes, they worked very hard, but it was inside the house. Um, in my study, I only found two women, one a 22-year-old stenographer and one who may have worked at a shoe factory in Brockton where her husband worked after they were married. The rest of the women were all homemakers. But 55% of the fatalities were men. Easton in 1915 was 3/4 native born, including people whose parents were immigrants, like the many Swedes, and 1/4 foreign born. But 44%, almost half, of the fatalities were foreign born. 5 came from Portugal, which doesn't sound like a gigantic number, but hold on. 3 came from Sweden. So those were the 2 hardest hit groups. Relatively few Irishmen died. All fatalities were from blue collar workers' families. Either the husband was a blue collar worker and brought the disease home from wherever they worked. 5 were in shoe related industries like the shoe factories in Brockton or Ross Heel, which was down in Southeastern where the car wash is. And a number had a connection. What is that? 5, I think it is. 5 had a connection to the shovel shops. Okay. 2 were associated with the foundries in the furnace village. So if you take a look at this rather complicated thing here, the way that you calculate the impact so that you're comparing apples and apples is flu deaths per 100,000. So 726 people per 100,000 died of the flu in Massachusetts. Boston had a worse record than that. Bridgewater and Easton had better records than that. But if you look here where it says Easton native, Easton natives did really, really well. 389 people per 100,000 died as compared to 726 in the state. So Easton was a nice, safe place to be if you were a native-born person. What's the difference between native-born people and foreign-born people? One step up in the social rankings. Native-born people tended to occupy middle-class jobs, which were cleaner. Portuguese, 3,750 deaths per 100,000. That's because of the 5 Portuguese people who died in Easton. There were only 133 Portuguese people in town at the time to begin with. So they suffered greatly. Dr. Tilden was absolutely right when he said that. And the Swedes were less than the state average, but still higher than the native born. And then you can see some of the other towns as well. There's a really good book recently that came out on Norwood, and you can see that their foreign-born population suffered greatly as well. If you look at this other one, comparing state records, you can see for the first time flu deaths for Brockton. I didn't have that on the other chart. Let's see. So that's that. What's my conclusion? My conclusion is that one of the contributing factors to making tuberculosis bad was working conditions that had a lot of air pollution, dust and smoke and all things that you'd associate with heavy industry like the Stanley Works in Bridgewater or the shovel company here. Or if you look at Brockton, the shoe factories had high humidity and a lot of dust and interesting chemicals. Both of those categories would cause people with tuberculosis and even people who were healthy to have weakened lung capacity. When the flu came along, those people would die. And I think that's something that we need to look at, underlying causes of um, the same thing with COVID. Why are we going through a situation now where blue collar people and people of color who are poor are having a higher impact of COVID? I think there are environmental factors that are contributing to it. Well, where are we with time? Whoa, it's 8 o'clock. So I will just shut up now for a few seconds. And if anybody has any questions or comments, please share. Can you open this up, Marion?
Yeah, you can all unmute yourselves if you'd like, and ask Ed questions. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, Larry, any questions, hon?
Larry?
I had a quick question. I think was there not a shoe factory that happened maybe on Mechanic Street behind Main Street?
Yeah. One thing I didn't show you was the breakdown of what streets the most deaths occurred on. Mechanic Street was numero uno in Easton, and there were at least 2 deaths associated with that shoe factory there.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
How about Ed, the Steadfast Rubber? Did that start before or after the 1918 influenza?
I believe it started afterwards. One of the guys that did die, one of the Portuguese guys on Mullen Lane, actually worked at a rubber factory in Stoughton, but not here.
So Ed, just an observation that has always puzzled me.
Watch it to the end.
My mother was born in 1902, so she would have been 17, 18 years old during this. She had, my grandparents raised a foster family, and one of the girls died of the flu. My mother never mentioned this pandemic. We tend to think like what we're going to think 15 years from now, we'll discover some, mask that got tucked away somewhere, and we go, oh, remember that. But, the epidemic itself is probably more horrifying for people because they had very little control over it, little ways of defeating it. But, it just seemingly wasn't ever mentioned.
Right. There's a psychological process where if you go through a traumatic event, you don't necessarily talk about it for a number of time. And the problem with a pandemic is that, flu epidemics come along every year, and Grampy shuffles off at one of those. So it seems like a not unusual occurrence. There was a pandemic in 1889 that carried off 1 million people. There was a pandemic in the 1950s that carried off 1 million people worldwide. This one carried off about 50 million people worldwide, and another one in the 60s. So this is just sort of a fact of life. Plus, you had the TB plague that was going around. People just died of stuff that we don't think of anymore, and that was just the way it was.
Yeah.
I think this one will be remembered.
Maybe. Well, I get it. Maybe polio. Think about the great fear of polio from my childhood. That I was little and just barely aware of it. But that was something that really frightened people. And you never hear anybody really talking about it now.
Yeah.
There's many other more important things, aren't there?
Well, I know of at least one person in town who has the post-polio syndrome.
Yeah.
So there's an instance there where it's a continuing thing. I had polio when I was 2 years old, luckily. The good news there, oh, God rest my mother's soul, but the argument was that polio became epidemic in the United States after hygiene improved so much that kids did not catch disease until they got older, and it was much more devastating. So because my mother let me play in the mud, I guess I came down with
at a young enough age.
Yep.
Yeah, that was, I've been reading a little bit about, I was in the trial group for the vaccine in the 1954 when I was in second grade. But the research design initially was going to vaccinate groups of people who were vulnerable to getting it, and then observe people who weren't. They weren't going to use a placebo. And one of the problems with that is the difference in the disparity. It was middle-class people who were getting polio because they had kept their children free of germs relatively. And the people who would not be getting polio were a very different socioeconomic class. And so the study itself would have been flawed. So they found that they had to do is have a placebo group where they injected, which is, from what my sister tells me, is what happened to me. I was in the placebo group.
Huh.
I don't remember.
That explains a lot.
That explains a lot, yeah.
I can
Hey,
remember.
Ed.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes, go ahead.
yeah. Ed, Scott Cudsey, I just wanted to fill in and thank you for, mentioning my great uncle there, who was victim number one,
Yeah.
Albert Gatchell. And actually, it's spelled Gatchell, G-I-T.
Fix that.
Everybody gets it wrong, but it's a family, so we know how to spell it. But just to give everybody a little history on what happened afterwards, he went to the camp infirmary and was there for a few months, and actually he survived the influenza, the Spanish flu, and lived to be, geez, I can't remember how old, but he died in 1957. And after the army, he opened a butcher shop back in South Dakota, where he came from, and that was his whole life, being around food and cooking and stuff like that. So, being victim number one, and he was actually serving food that morning, and he was the first one at the infirmary, and he was followed, they said, by 90 other people by the end of the day, because everybody's passing by him in the chow line when he's handing out food, and came down with the influenza. So, you feel kind of guilty that, here's my great uncle who infected and probably killed a lot of people, but on the other hand, it's not his fault. It's something that he just caught from someplace. But he did survive the whole thing and lived to be like 74, 75 years old.
Any last questions? We're kind of running over time.
We're over time. I don't want to, I've bored people enough.
No.
Well, just a quick comment. I mean, you think that this has happened along with World War I, so you have two enormous social disasters going
Yeah,
in
that's a
parallel.
really good point, Bill. That may also explain why people don't talk about it so much. It's just got rolled up with all the rest of the World War I stuff.
Right, yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it was horrible for everybody, so. Then in the interim, you had a depression and another world war, so. And a stock market crash. It's
Yes,
always something.
it's always something. You're right. Well,
Is that the conclusion of this talk?
That's right.
It's always something.
Buckle up, it's always something.
Thank you very much, Ed.
okay, thank you.
Ed,
Great
thank you
job,
so
Ed.
much. On behalf of the library, thank you for giving us an incredible program, and we will reschedule your whiskey. After this one, we need to do whiskey. So,
Thank you very
Look
much.
forward to that one.
yeah, thanks so much. And thank
Okay.
you, everybody, for coming. We really
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
nice job. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everybody. Bye, Ed.
Bye.
Bye, Janice. Oh,
Thank
bye.
you.
Funny to see everybody. Yeah.
Oh, look at them all. Wow, they all
Yeah.
stayed. Holy cow.
Goes back on. It's okay.
Bye, Betsy.
Bye. Nice
Nice to not see you, but I did. Bye, Debbie.
She's here.
Bye, Beth.
No, you
Oh,
can't.
hi, Betsy. Where are you?
Oh, I'm
We didn't turn the
We don't need
camera.
to see you. It's okay. It's okay. I'll see you in the street and thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
It was good.
Bye-bye
Enjoyed
now.
the
Thanks for
program.
the invite.
All right. Bye-bye.